Everyone. My name is Serge Bui. I am AIC's Chief Executive Officer, and welcome to our third moderated discussion, the 2022 Insights webinar series. I will be the moderator today. I would like to start by thanking the following organization for partnering with us for this event: Agwas Bio and Galing. But before we begin our moderated discussion, I have a few technical notes to share. The chat bar will not be active for the attendees. That said, you're welcome to ask your questions using the Q&A button. You will find that normally at the bottom of your screen. If you see a question asked by another attendee that you like and that you would like it to be answered in priority, you may upvote it in order to move it up the queue. If you prefer to ask your question verbally, please use the raised hand button next to the Q&A button. Once identified, you will be invited to unmute yourself to ask your question. We're extremely pleased today to welcome our panel of experts. Joining us are Dr. Alex Vahid, Chief Academic Officer at Higher Colleges of Technology in Abu Dhabi, Megan Gervas, Director of Intellectual Property at Protein Industries Canada, Tamara AlShabib, Senior Patent and Technology Transfer Consultant at Galing in Dubai, Jeff Coles, IP Lawyer and Patent Agent at Galing in Canada this time. Not everybody can be in the sun and the warmth. Before beginning the moderated discussion, I now invite our panelists to say a few words about themselves and their organization and why they're participating today. I'm going to start by Tamara AlShabib. Tamara.
Thanks, Serge, and hi, everyone. So as Serge said, I'm based in the Dubai office. I'm the Senior Patent and Tech Transfer Consultant. Basically, I've spent the last 12 years in the region. I spent 8 years of that working with a non-profit semi-government entity in Qatar called the Qatar Foundation, which was focused on building human capital through education, research, and community development. During my time there, I helped them establish an institutional IP policy and a technology transfer office to help manage and commercialize the outputs of their research programs. In the last 5 years, I've been based in the UAE. I've been working on the private sector side. So I've been working with clients, helping them to establish similar sort of policies and practices, but from the other side. That's all.
Great, thank you very much. And to round up the team in the sun and the warmth, we're going to go to Dr. Alex Vahid. Alex, if you can introduce yourself and say a few words on why you're here.
Assalamu alaikum and Ramadan Kareem from Abu Dhabi, the United Arab Emirates. I'm Dr. Alex Vahid. I'm the Chief Academic Officer of the Higher Colleges of Technology here. The Higher Colleges of Technology actually it should be familiar to a lot of Canadians because it was started by Canadians about 30 years ago. It's modeled on the Ontario and the Alberta college systems. So there's a lot of similarities in that sense. It is a federal entity, so we are funded fully by the federal government of the United Arab Emirates. We have coverage across the entire country. As the Chief Academic Officer, I have responsibility for the entire academic operations, which includes our research and our entrepreneurship and innovation programs. We have 16 campuses, 20,000 students, homogeneous all Emiratis across the country, delivering programs, health sciences, businesses, education, engineering, computer sciences. Interesting little bit of information. The HCT modeled their applied research and innovation space after the Canadian college system, in particular, my former institution, the Southern Alberta Institute of Technology, SAIT, in Calgary. And while there's incubators in and around the country, HCT was designated a free zone by the Emirati government, which allowed us to create what we call incubation spaces, innovation and incubator spaces. During the pandemic, believe it or not, we started up 160 companies, and of those, 30 have trade licenses and are generating revenue today. So we have a very aggressive startup program, and that is part of the UAE economic strategy. Prior to coming to this place, I know nothing about moderate climates. I lived in Calgary for 20 years, where it hits minus 45. Here it hits plus 45. And started up the applied research innovation space with a good colleague of ours from Gowling, Dan Polaneko, helped a lot with developing our intellectual property policy at SAIT. And we ran a very successful, and it's still a going concern right now at SAIT in the applied research space. So thank you very much for the invitation to participate.
Great, and salam alaikum to you as well. And inshallah, we'll have a great meeting today. So now I'm going to turn to Megan Gervas, Director of Intellectual Property at Protein Industries Canada. Megan.
Thank you. So as Serge mentioned, I'm Megan Gervas. I am the Director of Intellectual Property for Protein Industries Canada currently. And so for those who may not be familiar with Protein Industries Canada, just at a high level, we're one of Canada's 5 innovation superclusters. And so in 2018, the Government of Canada identified 5 areas of high economic growth potential for Canada and set up what we refer to as a supercluster for each of those areas. The one that we're focused on is plant protein specifically, so agri-food, increasing the value of the crops that we grow in Canada. And a large part of that work is through domestic processing. And so since 2018, we've leveraged our $173 million contribution from the supercluster with industry investment into nearly $500 million worth of project activity that is to be completed by March 31st, 2023. And so we have about a year left in our current mandate. And so we partner with industry. All of our projects are industry driven. And so thinking about how intellectual property impacts the companies that we're working with, many of whom are SMEs, has been a big part of my focus over the past 3 years here at TIC. And so we have processes in place around intellectual property that all of our projects go through. And then there's sort of the principles behind the way that we look at companies working with IP. And so that's kind of the lens that I'll be bringing to the conversation today. My own background is in process engineering, and I've worked in Canadian research organizations throughout my career. Both on the technical side, so actually doing, the engineering work per se, and then in more sort of business development and administrative roles around managing intellectual property.
Great.
That is who I am and why I'm here.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. And last but not least, Jeff Coles at Gallings, Canada, also in the cold.
Thank you, Serge. Yeah, very much in the cold in the last week or so with the amount of snow we've had here in Calgary. So my name is Jeff Coles. I'm a partner with Gowling WLG. I'm in the Calgary office. I actually just recently moved my practice to Alberta and Calgary not too long before the pandemic hit, so in 2018. In the past, my work had focused mostly in the life sciences sphere and particularly pharmaceuticals, doing a lot of work on pharmaceutical patenting and also pharmaceutical litigation. That was during my time in Ontario. Having moved out to Alberta, I guess I get to focus a bit more on some of my historic interests and those being agriculture. So I've shifted my practice a bit to work to focus it on agri-tech and agri-innovation. Currently represent one of the largest cannabis companies in the world and work with them to protect their intellectual property, but also work with numerous other clients here in the prairies to make sure their innovations are properly protected and that they're developing the right IP strategy to do so. And as I mentioned, it hits at home to me. I'm from the Maritimes. My grandparents were farmers in Prince Edward Island, and I saw the progression with their farm from their generation, from a time when it was big, prosperous, profitable, to the next generation taking it over and actually having to sell the farm because it was no longer profitable for the way the family was running the business. So I have a deep interest in agri-tech and making sure it's properly protected so that, family farms do not, can continue to have a livelihood. I really have a passion for this work. So a bit about Gowling WLG for those who are unfamiliar or who may not know. We're an international law firm. We have offices throughout Canada, and we also have offices in a number of countries around the world, including the UK, China, and obviously Tamara is with us today from our Dubai office. This gives us a really unique perspective, but also a unique opportunity for our clients who are looking to protect their intellectual property around the world, in that we do have colleagues throughout the globe, all over the globe, to assist. I'm really looking forward to this panel today. I think we've got a number of fantastic people who have very diverse fields of expertise on the line, and Serge, thank you to AIC for hosting this.
You're welcome, Jeff. And building on your passion for the ag tech sector and agriculture, I'm going to ask the first question in terms of what are the challenges, historical or current, faced by Canadian ag tech innovators or the ag tech sector generally in developing and commercializing innovation, and move forward as well on the common misconception and pitfalls regarding IP protection in the ag tech space. So those, I'm combining two things. And I'm going to ask you, Jeff, to respond first, but I'm going to open it up after that to everybody, to Megan first, Tamara second, and Alex third. So Jeff, go first, please.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Serge. There are a lot of topics or issues we could speak about on that. I think for me, two of the forefront on challenges that historical or otherwise that the ag tech sector has faced. I think one of them is a disconnect between industries, perhaps. I think although agriculture and ag tech is one of the largest industries in the world, it's probably one of the least digitized industries in the world today. So I think unfortunately ag tech has been slow to take up digital technologies, not for any reason of lack of interest or trying, so to speak, but just the way the industry is and the way it has developed, it's been a bit slower to take up some of the digitization technologies. So I think that's one thing where, and I think we're starting to see a lot of advances in this space, and the industry really does require digitization across the entire supply chain. I mean, often when we think agriculture, we think about food, but there's a lot more to it than that. I mean, clearly there's industrial materials such as bioplastic, biocomposites. I mean, these sectors as well, could benefit greatly from technologies developed in different industries. And I think we're starting to see in Canada more crosstalk between industries. And I think some of this is brought on by the great work of some of the government initiatives, but also some of the accelerators or incubators that have started to pop up in Canada, which really do promote information sharing and dissemination of technologies from one industry to another. Another aspect of a challenge, and I think one of the biggest challenges the ag tech industry has faced, is insufficient capital or equity resource. And unfortunately, I think Canada has seen this to a larger scale than from a global perspective. I know some of the numbers on this front, I was actually looking at them before this talk. According to Ag Funder, 10 years ago, globally, there was about $2 billion worth of investment from venture capital into the ag tech industry. Before COVID, that had gone up to about 20 billion. And in the last year, globally, it was around 51 billion. for VC investment in this space. Unfortunately, Canada is quite different. I think in 2020, there has been an improvement, I think, but we're certainly not seeing our fair share yet of VC or private equity investment in the ag tech space. So I think that's one of the challenges faced. Just very quickly, I know I'm taking a bit of time here. Some of the misconceptions, I mean, they're not so different than what we see in other industries. There's, and perhaps the one I'll hit home on is, I think a lot of startups and entrepreneurs in academia, one thing to always be thinking of, it's not only for the big players here. We see all the time the great stories, particularly in Canada, of the small companies really having great success stories. One of them I can think of is Decisive Farms, which was started back in 2011 by two brothers, and in 2019 was acquired by TELUS. When they built their company up to have over 1,500 farms in their repertoire, so to speak. So that's, I think, some of the challenges and some of the misconceptions there. The industry really, it's not just for big players. The small players should do what they can to get involved.
Thank you for that, Jeff. I'm going to move to Megan for the next one, and Tamara third, and Alex fourth. Great.
Thank you. And Jeff, I really agree with a lot of what you said there. I think something that we see as a challenge when we have companies come in with a project idea is that there's not always sort of the ground truthing of what the technology that they're building is and how it will apply to all of the different parts of the value chain that they'll be touching. And so I think there's still work to be done in ensuring that the projects and the technologies that are being developed are meeting a real need and addressing a challenge that really is out there for the industry. And engaging with the full value chain and not sort of just looking at the one spot where you think you're making an impact, but also, what are the implications for other parts of the value chain, and what are maybe some opportunities to build more tech into that'll give you a more fulsome solution that is more investable when we come to talk about access to capital and the growth. I do think that, kind of taking it from the high level view, the problem or the challenge isn't necessarily the technologies that are being developed. However, it really is all those things that support the growth of companies here domestically. So it's the access to capital, it's having a talent pool that's ready and able to jump in and work on the development of those technologies, and not just at the seed sort of stage, but as the company grows. We have a real shortage of people in the tech space who are able to come in and do that work. And then having a regulatory environment that moves at the speed of business so that, the technologies that are developed, even if they're great, if they can't meet regulatory requirements or aren't sort of allowed to operationalize, that can be a huge hurdle as well. So I think from my perspective, those are some of the biggest challenges that we kind of see here at PIC and hear from our members are challenges that they're facing.
I would agree with Megan a lot on some of the points she said as well. So I think, we do have some unique challenges here in terms of the innovation ecosystem. But in terms of funding, there is quite a bit of public funding going on in that space. The issue is that they recognize that public funding is not sustainable in the long term. So there needs to be more of a mix or a balance between public and private investment in this space. But speaking to startups in this area, I can see that there is more seed funding, but when it comes to scaling up, that's where they have an issue getting more funding or more capital. Other issues I think we have in the UAE and maybe the region generally is the IP infrastructure. So in terms of registering IP, enforcing IP, it's a little bit more gray here in the sense that there's little access to IP information. For example, patents here are not really published until after they're granted, and they're only published in Arabic, and the patent office doesn't maintain a searchable database. So it's difficult to see who has technology in this area in the UAE. And so, how do you know if you're potentially infringing on somebody else's IP or not? How do you use the IP data to your advantage? I think there's just generally sort of low awareness of the value of IP as well. So even in terms of helping startups or SMEs sort of do self IP audits or utilize their IP assets to create an IP strategy that can help them sort of grow their businesses in the region and abroad. I think that's lacking in the region. I think that on top of the other issues that they probably have to think about in the region. So if they're working in tech, we have a major water scarcity issue here. Water is expensive. We don't really have much arable land. We've got dust and sand issues. So they're working in a very extreme climate as well. So it's going to be probably more energy intensive as well, coming up with anything that can grow and survive in this climate. So on top of the other challenges that Megan and Jeff mentioned, I think they also have to think about how do we use technology to create something that actually is sustainable in this environment.
So I'm going to take a slightly different tact on this, and I think experiencing both the Canadian product development and agricultural side of things versus the Arabic side. I mean, I was deeply involved in a project at SAIT using RFID technology after the mad cow disease breakout, tracking and tracing the animals. We invested substantially. We had good NSERC support from it, but we also had the Alberta beef industry heavily supported behind it. The reason I bring that up is the challenges I think the ag industry often faces is crisis driven. It's not strategic driven, it's crisis driven. And the UAE is no different. And Tamara brought up a really good important point. And I think the current geopolitical circumstances are highlighting things even greater, that food security and also access to markets on a global basis is a huge, huge challenge to try and get your finger on. So while, we all know that this little country is not lacking for funding, Lord knows they'll turn every drop of water into, high salinity water into water that you can grow something with, and they'll pay the price for it. They are incorporating technologies, I think, that even Canada could take a look at just because of the harsh environment. So for instance, greenhouses. Greenhouses have been a Canadian mainstay forever and ever and ever. And they're just starting to kind of get to that level, but incorporating solar technology into the greenhouses for that energy cost type of thing is something, because we have that high sun exposure. But guess what we have? We have a lot of dust. And as we experienced with solar farms in Alberta, the dust just dropped the efficiency on solar powered pumping stations for farms. Well, the same thing is happening here. They just can't keep their solar panels clean. People don't associate that with the ag industry, but it's fundamental. And there's, I think, a lot of collaborative opportunities that people have to start taking a look at from a food security and a supply chain basis, that all of a sudden, okay, does intellectual property matter as much as getting the goods to the market? And yeah, you might want to protect things jointly, and Tamara rightly pointed out, the IP environment in this part of the world is fascinating, and that's being generous, versus what we experience in a fairly regulated, controlled environment in North America. But it doesn't mean that there can't be a sharing of knowledge, and I call it lateral knowledge sharing. What's harsh in Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba is equally harsh in this part of the world as well. And I think those kind of challenges have to be looked at from a global perspective, as opposed to just an insular Canadian or UAE or Kuwait or wherever it may be. And I think that's something that needs to be taken a look at, especially, and I know for a fact, within the superclusters within the CFREF environment. There is funding for partnering internationally. I wrote some of those applications, so I think those researchers need to maybe get out of the snowdrifts in Canada and come to the sand dunes in the UAE and talk to a few people here and share some of the mutual experiences in those parts of the world.
Great, thank you very much, Alex. That was really interesting. And I'm going to try to get to another question that I'd like all of you to weigh in from your own perspective in your region, with Alex being able to be in two regions in a way, from your experience in Canada and now your experience in the UAE. But what steps have the UAE and Canada, please answer based on your perspective, taken to boost local innovation and attract innovative startup companies and SMEs to their region, and support them in the development of IP strategies? So I'm going to start by you, Alex, because you've got that view on the both regions, and then I'll go to Tamara to provide us that perspective from the UAE specifically. Then I'll go to Megan and Jeff, who are going to provide us their insights on that as well. So Alex, please start.
So that's a really cool question, because of it's largely driven by regional economic development. Okay, and from past experience in Alberta, I would say the ag industry was taken for granted for the sake of the oil and gas and the high tech industry. You know, the sun is going to come up every day, it's going to rain, we're going to plant, we're going to grow, we're going to harvest, and away we go. As opposed to, geez, we're going to drill, we're going to have to deal with abandoned wells, and oh, by the way, Nortel blew up on us, and so went that kind of stuff. And now those were Alberta government economic development strategies. And I think the promotion of startups and incorporation of that into the ag economy was largely happenstance. And I think having it's interesting that you have a federal government program driving this stuff that kind of dragged the provinces along kicking and screaming at a regional level, because you had to have that co-funded to support things like the CFREF grants and NSERC grants and things like that. And I know in the Canadian College Fund through NSERC, everything has to involve industry. There is no discovery research for college funding for NSERC grants. So you're forced to find those partners, forced to find those startups. And you know, there was like I go back to the example we did with the RFID project. We spun off, not ourselves, but you know, entrepreneurs out in the field, the incorporation of that tracking and tracing, that farm to the fork kind of philosophy that started up companies on a happenstance, not on a strategic, deliberate basis. Contrast that with this country. This country is huge on vision. So vision here means, okay, we need food security. We need AI. And oh, by the way, maybe we can combine the two into agriculture. And then off you go. And that's about it. And all of a sudden, you know, 100 million dirhams will pop up. And next thing you know, okay, we got an app for this or an app for that. And now you've got a startup. So there's analogies that are similar here, that you have this kind of happenstance thing. While they claim there's a strategy, it's not a strategy. It's a vision. And Tamara can attest to that. I think the entire city of Dubai was built on a vision and not by strategy. And you just have to drive the roads to experience that. But it happens. You know, stuff happens. There's no doubt that the central ag community in the UAE is around Al Ain. It's the oasis of the country, so to speak. And you see, it's the most bizarre thing, you know, between Al Ain and Dubai, you will see this green patch of land with irrigation on it in the middle of summer. And it is green at 45 Celsius. What are they doing? They're growing the feed for the cattle that never leave the barns. And that's where the milk comes from. And out of that came some very creative ways of harvesting the feed, the hay, in the middle of just a devastating hot 4-month summer. And they do it. And that's largely built into the farms that operate there. The date farm technology, and then, as I said, the greenhouse technology is spinning out these things. But let's make no mistake about it. They're heavily subsidized by oil and gas. Bottom line, the country operates by what the world pays for a barrel of oil into the UAE sovereign fund. And I think that's the big distinction. The Canadian model is based on, taxpayers' money supporting through these programs. The UAE, it's oil and gas money that pops up to build whatever they want to build. And in this case, it's going to be food security based technologies.
Just to add to that, I think Alex did a great job of just summarizing the situation here. But I think, they definitely pay for everything using the oil and gas sort of export money that comes through. That's what's been driving growth in the UAE for the last, I would say, 15, 20 years at least. But I think it's times like the last couple of years where they can see, like when the price of oil drops and they see that their population is growing, there's rising consumption every year. And I think that worries them in the long term that this isn't sustainable. And I think that's pushed also this food security higher on the agenda. So they come up with visions. So back in 2018, just before the crisis, actually, they came up with this national food security strategy. And the idea is to help them create to become more self-sufficient. They want to increase sort of domestic production. They want to diversify their supply sources so that they're not in a situation where, they can't meet the, local demand. Some of the initiatives that they've launched, and I guess because these are all quite recent, so we need some time to sort of see how they play out. They have created sort of an authority to implement the National Food Security Strategy, which is called the Emirates Food Security Council. And they're basically tasked with making sure they meet the goals of that strategy. And then under the umbrella of that, they've also created something called the Food Tech Valley, which I've been reading a lot on recently, which is basically like an integrated city. And the idea behind that is they want that city to be able to triple food production. And that city is supposed to have sort of R&D facilities. It's going to be an incubator. They want to be able to do a lot of testing of technologies that are in that whole food production and supply value chain. So they want to attract startups from around the world to that, and then sort of become a hub for innovation-driven food security technology. That's one. I think I also read recently about a research platform. So what they want to do is basically have any research related to food security available on this public platform that's accessible from public and private sector as well. So they're trying to increase knowledge in the space and have that available for others to learn from and build on, and sort of accelerate the pace of innovation in that space. And then, like Alex said as well, they're using AI as well. So they have like dashboards where they're using AI and analytics to sort of track where they are in terms of supply and demand. And they've also created a bunch of legislation around food waste, how to deal with that as well. Yeah, and I recently read as well, I think they invested around 1 billion dirhams, which is about just over $300 million in 4 ag tech companies. And this investment came from ADIO, which is basically managing a lot of the sovereign wealth fund money and investing that on their behalf. And the idea behind that is that they're going to be building R&D facilities and production facilities. So they really are trying to meet local demand through these companies based here. Yeah, so I guess there's different angles they're tackling it from. I think, you know, investments, creating the incubators, basically trying to put the elements together to create sort of an innovation ecosystem within that space. But how that plays along is really important, how they, I guess, manage it and administer it and sort of track it over time. This is all quite recent, but I know there is a push towards that because of, they know that, you know, oil exports is not going to last forever, and the demand for food is going up. And if oil prices drop again, that could be problematic for them because they have to then rely on, you know, their foreign currency reserves or their sovereign wealth fund to pay for it instead. So.
Thank you, Megan, please.
Yeah, thank you, Alex and Tamara. I think really interesting comments and really contrasting, you know, the challenge and crisis point of having limitations on the resources that you have and the environment that you're working in against sort of the abundance that we have in Canada with, you know, farmland and water and all of those things. And it kind of makes you think about, you know, when you have such an abundant environment, that drive to innovate might not be there in quite the same way. Building on sort of what Alex was commenting on around, you know, supporting the ecosystem that is required for SMEs to grow has really been a focus of the superclusters. And so, you know, we have groups of companies who've come together to do projects, but those groups of companies are all facing some of the same challenges. And so bringing together, you know, the thought leaders and policy opportunities for change that will support those companies' growth is a piece of what the superclusters are doing. But I think one of the, most beneficial aspect of the way that the supercluster program was designed is that multinational companies who come in and do projects in our program are required to always have an SME brought along, at least one, as part of their project. And so we have situations where you see Roquette, for example, working with Prairie Fava, which is a small startup focused on fava bean crops in Canada. And so that really gives those SMEs an opportunity to not only, you know, have a customer for the product that they're working on, because they're often integrating their two businesses together, but also just to have that mentorship from a large company and learn kind of how to grow their business sustainably and what they're going to need to do to be prepared to become one of those larger companies. I think there's been a recognition in, I can speak to PIC specifically around how intellectual property plays into the supercluster program and the requirements that companies have to meet. So there are things that we need to do in the supercluster in terms of having IP rationales, and we have an IP hub where it's sort of a view into the intellectual property being developed, but also to allow companies to be flexible enough in developing their IP strategy so that it's not IP built for the sake of IP in a project, but looking at their product and how their product goes out to market and what they need to do for their business strategy, and then design the IP strategy as a layer within that, not as its own sort of other thing floating over on the side. So I think, you know, that flexibility has been important. And for Canadian SMEs, we have sort of a different lens on who their customer is, and that Canada is, at the end of the day, a relatively small market for some of the technologies that are being developed. And so we need to look at our customers being global and have companies and SMEs in particular thinking that way from the start as they're developing their tech, as they're setting out their IP strategy, and as they're building their IP strategy. So I don't know if I really answered the question off the top, but this is where I got to after Alex and Tamara's comments. Very
good. Jeff, your turn.
Well, I mean, I think I'd start off echoing the point that Alex made. You know, I'm a practitioner here in Calgary, so I mean, obviously, I'm in Alberta, which obviously has had a predominant oil and gas industry for the past number of decades. So, you know, obviously, I could talk about you know, in the region, you know, the biggest changes I'm seeing are you know, an influx of accelerators or incubators or whatever that you know, focus more on ag tech and putting, helping out ag tech, getting ag tech innovation, commercializing this technology, getting proper IP protection in place, those things, that is certainly happening. I think, in my practice, from a day-to-day perspective, I think one of the biggest changes I'm seeing and one of the most beneficial changes I'm seeing from my clients is, I see great ideas, hopefully on a daily basis, but maybe more realistically on a weekly basis. I see great ideas all the time, and some of it, there's a big difference between a great idea and actually putting it to practice. And that's what I'm starting to see here more in Alberta over my 4 or 5 years having been here. We've had a number of, you can look back and historically these institutions have been in place, such as SAIT and NATE as well, to help innovators, scale up their technologies, prove their technologies work. But more in the ag tech space, particularly, we're seeing institutions like Olds College. There's Olds College Smart Farms now, which is really it's fantastic organization or tool, almost I would call it, to take a great idea, test it out, and see if it works. And in my field, in the patenting space, like I say, I see the good ideas all the time, but seeing them through it and having an innovator who's able to actually take it from idea to practice and then commercialize it is something I'm seeing happen more easily here in Calgary recently than it used to be. In the cannabis space as well, I have a few clients who, same thing, just getting the idea and getting it into a practical form and testing it out and proof of concept. There are more mechanisms available, more opportunity available. And that, again, that goes alongside the accelerators, the incubators, the government funding that's flowing into ag tech as well. All of this is good, is stimulating the ecosystem. So I think that's one of the biggest changes I've seen in my practice in the last 4 or 5 years is just a greater ability for my small startup clients to actually test and improve their technologies.
Thank you, Jeff. That's much appreciated. We're actually going to go to a question asked by one of our guests, Dr. Abhishek Mani Tripathi, who Jeff does want to connect with you at some point. He's based in Eastern Ontario, in Ontario, so sorry, but working on the global market. But the question that he has is, I think, really interesting in terms of it seems that the UAE is adapting vertical farming on a rapid pace. What do you think of the collaboration between Canadian companies for funding and technology transfer on that front, and the protection of intellectual property? Because often intellectual property is at risk when some of those international collaboration happens. So vertical farming, a very modern concept. I don't know about modern, but it is a concept that is popping up more and more. We're talking about it in northern Canada. Visibly, it's being talked about in the UAE, so at a different 90-degree difference. But again, how do you think this collaboration could happen for funding, technology transfer, while protecting intellectual property? So I'm going to go to Jeff first, and then Dr. Zahavich, Tamara, and then Megan. And Megan, I do want to go back to the supercluster in the next question, but Jeff first, please.
Yeah, I think vertical farming is obviously a great technology, and I like this question. It kind of hits on something I wanted to bring up when Serge, when you had asked the earlier question about misconceptions and pitfalls as well. I think I'm a strong proponent of collaboration. I've seen too often that particularly startup companies or early stage companies are too quick to jump into collaboration without getting, and this is going to be the lawyer in me speaking, without getting the proper agreements in place as to what IP is each company bringing to the table, who's going to own the IP that's developed. Again, I'm a strong proponent of collaboration. I just think companies need to step back before they get involved in that collaboration. Think about the agreements that should be in place. I mean, there's going to be an exchange of potentially highly valuable information in the collaboration, and there's going to be new IP that's generated. You need to put on your hat that says, hey, I'm gonna watch out for my interests here, and make sure you have proper agreements in place before you step into those collaborations. And on the vertical farming front, I mean, I've actually had a few clients in that space here in Alberta, and it's a great technology. I mean, the more we can collaborate with international entities who are also developing technology in this space to move it forward at a faster pace, in a manner that is going to help ag tech and people in the ecosystem in our country and the UAE, wherever. I think that's great. As to funding mechanisms, I mean, I think it's, and this is just, I guess, based on personal experience, I think particularly for Canadian companies, the funding is going to be mostly those opportunities we've already spoken about. Again, the government of Canada is putting a lot of, or has promised at least to put a lot of money into the ag tech sector, ag tech, clean tech. So there should be some funding there to help companies along. I'll let one of our other panelists speak more to the UAE side of things, but there's certainly, I would hope, funding there and opportunity to work in these collaborations.
So just to follow up on that last point from Jeff, couple things to take away from this. And I'll preface this by saying you can take the boy out of Canada, but you can't take the Canadian out of the boy. And the reason I say that, Jeff's legal advice is something that resonates near and dear to my heart living in this country. We had a delegation here, a Canadian delegation of about 30 Canadian colleges and universities. It was brought in by Global Affairs Canada towards the end of Expo when they celebrated Canada Day at Expo. And the reason I bring this up is I think Global Affairs Canada is doing their darndest around the world with limited resources they have. Unfortunately, the federal government has really not tossed a lot into the collaborative space, but I think they're starting to support that expansion to markets outside Canada. When we were advising startups at SAIT, we always said, the market is not Alberta. The market is the world. You got to think in that kind of space. However, what that brings along is this legal thing, this entity. Let me just step back a bit, talk about the Expo thing. And I don't know, Tamara, how many times you got to Expo, but if you didn't notice the number of vertical farming examples in the various pavilions, you missed half of Expo. And one of the best examples that I saw was the Netherlands pavilion, where they had literally, they were extracting water out of the air to vertically grow plants on a chamber inside the pavilion. It was fascinating, simple technology, basically based on thermal gradients, nothing more than that. It was fascinating. And they grew this thing over the 6-month period. I visited that pavilion 3 times just to watch how the plants grew over that period of time. And so the other one, I think it was the Danes or the Finns, another one that showed this vertical farming in a very stacked automated thing. And that's what the UAE is looking at. I mean, it looks like a factory. The rotation of the vertical devices. It's quite fascinating on that. So as far as that technology goes, yes, that is being embraced in the UAE big time because it's efficient and it's got a lot of flashy bells and whistles, which the Emiratis love. But then there's the reality, and Tamara can follow up on this one. I was asked to speak to the delegates from the Canadian institutions about the realities of doing business in the UAE. In other words, if the Olds College wanted to come and share curriculum, sell curriculum to HCT for our food security program, you're looking at a 6-month procurement process. And on top of that, the laws of the UAE prevail. They will not go anywhere else. I was very fortunate, probably signed one of the last contracts when I left SAIT to come to HCT, that we were able to use London as the court of arbitration. After that, they changed the law. Most of the contracts now are UAE law. The one thing that has come along, fortunately, is you don't have to, because of the free zone, you don't have to have a company incorporated in the UAE. I can tell you, SAIT was approached from 2005 to 2015 3 times to do business here, to do oil and gas training. And the board at SAIT declined because we had to set up a company that was 51% owned by a sheikh, 49% owned by SAIT. Okay, so that has changed to be a little more business friendly. When it comes to intellectual property, the way they write their stuff, and they'll write it in Arabic, and then it gets lost in translation going to English, and they'll give you their interpretation from the Arabic, and you'll go, well, this is what it says in English, and the two shall not meet. And the whole thing about prior art and all that kind of stuff, it literally gets lost in translation. Having said that, there are opportunities. If you're patient, you'll learn how to culturally work with the organizations here. It's all about going, sitting, smoking shisha in the desert before you sign the contract. There's that kind of relationship building that has to take place. If you think you're going to come in and get a contract, it isn't going to happen. And this is the exact words that I said to my colleagues from the Canadian institutions. The relationship thing is a big deal here. And by the very nature of the region, trust is a very big challenge. I think Canadians are a very trusting culture. I think the Middle East, and if you trust your neighbor, that's maybe 2 steps far. I mean, that's how that whole legal thing gets involved. So in short, you go in eyes wide open.
So just to touch on what Alex said as well, if you're looking to come into the UAE, I guess there's sort of one of 3 channels. You could either try to work with the government, but like Alex said, that takes time. There's a lot of bureaucracy involved, and it could, there's no guarantees that it'll go through. It's good to you have to have a network here, contacts, that kind of helps your case a bit better. The other way is to sort of enter into a research collaboration with a university or research organization here. IP is important in that scenario. So like Jeff said, before entering into a collaboration, you need to make very clear what IP the startup has developed on its own, and then what IP is sort of project IP that's being developed as part of the collaboration. And then what are your plans for commercialization, whether you want to agree on that in the collaboration or whether you want to refer to that in a separate agreement. But here there's a focus on bringing startups to the UAE and then sort of helping them grow out from the UAE. And they really do want to invest in creating knowledge and creating sort of a thriving private sector that's tech-based as well. And so IP is becoming more important for them, and they are pushing for IP ownership in more of these collaboration agreements. The third way of coming into the UAE is through one of the startup incubators. So these are usually based in free zones. And like Alex mentioned, the free zones are sort of considered sort of off non-mainland areas. So none of the local laws apply to you, none of the, it's tax-free. It's supposed to be easier for business setup, so they don't have to worry about if you were opening a business mainland, you'd have to have a local partner that would have 51% of the business. But if you're opening in the free zones, you don't have to worry about that. You can fully own the company. And so as a startup, these incubators are usually based in the free zone so that you can come in and you can sort of make the most of the resources that they're making available to the startups, such as sort of free space and help with mentoring and some services as well. And the free zones tend to be themed as well. So for example, we're based in the IFC, which is the free zone for financial services and banking, but there is also a fintech incubator in the IFC. So all of sort of the latest technologies or startups that are coming in with the latest technologies that they want to test out, they're basically done in the fintech incubator, which is part of the free zone. So you would come in, you'd still own your IP. And the only thing to keep in mind though with the free zones is you can't really trade in the UAE through the startup. So you'd have to appoint like a local distributor if you wanted to sell anything in the UAE directly. So that's how they sort of keep some of that in the country as well. So those are the one of three ways. In terms of patent protection, there is a patent law. There was a new one actually that was published last year. I think they recognize that there is a need to improve the IP infrastructure here. If they're trying to attract innovative companies, they need to show them that they can protect their IP here. And so we're working with some government officials on a project related to that. And they are looking at how to make the UAE more similar to, I guess, countries like Singapore, who have managed to sort of advance their IP infrastructure really quickly in a relatively short amount of time. I know that they're looking at this from different angles. So sort of, you know, the legislation angles, what are the gaps in the legislation that we need to fill? The administrative angle in terms of, you know, registration, enforcement, how can we make things a bit easier for IP owners? And also from the business angle. So how can we show businesses with IP that we do value their IP and make it easier for them to get access to funding and financing? So they are looking at this, but things do take time here. So bear that in mind. But I know that IP is high on the agenda right now because they've realized that, you know, you can't really have an innovation strategy without having a robust IP infrastructure to support that.
So I think Jeff's comments off the top around stepping back before we jump into collaboration were really important and really, you know, align with the approach that we're seeing programs such as the superclusters and others take now, where collaboration is how these projects are going to run. And before a dollar goes into a project, there needs to be an agreement around background IP, foreground IP, and commercialization strategy. And so that is why, you know, this role exists within the superclusters, and I think we'll continue to see that evolve in other programs going forward. So freedom to operate and you know, the ability to execute on the work, have the jobs be in Canada is what, you know, where our priority is. Have the revenue stay here, I think, is the important consideration when we're looking at international partnership. My opinion is that it doesn't need to necessarily be ownership of the IP, right? There are ways to have licensed intellectual property be able to do your work that don't necessarily mean that the IP needs to be owned in wherever region. And so that's something we think about a lot. And because we work with so many formulation companies or companies developing a food product that is based on a trade secret formulation, there's kind of a unique challenge in that you're not going to patent your recipe per se for whatever the product is. And so I think in this space, with working with so many processors, it's maybe looked at a little bit differently.
Thank you, Megan, for this, and thank you everyone for your responses. I'm going to go back to you, Megan, and various people have talked throughout their presentation of incubators and the groupings, etc. And Protein Industries Canada plays an important role in Canada. The role that you play on intellectual property, I think is interesting. So I'm going to ask you to provide a bit of insight into that, and how you educate the companies that you work with on this. But I'm going to ask the others to comment as well on the models that work to provide education about IP to various startups, and I shouldn't say just startups, but the companies that exist that may ignore the pitfalls of IP. So I'm going to ask you first, Megan, in the context of your organization, but I'm going to ask all the others. So after you, Megan, I'm going to ask Alex, and then Tamara, and then Jeff, please.
Sure, thank you. This has really evolved, right? So over the past roughly 3 years, we've been executing on the supercluster program, and at the outset, I'd say it took a little while to get our heads around sort of the type of principles that we needed to guide IP decision making for our members. And so about a year into the program, we sort of stepped back from our initial IP strategy and did a bit of a rewrite on it and framed it around 4 principles for how IP in the supercluster, the Protein Industries Canada space would sort of be viewed. And so those principles, they're things that everybody talks about, but we kind of needed to condense them down to our space. And so the first one we talked about is that there are multiple different ways that IP can be, that Canada can benefit from the IP that the supercluster program was developing. And so it's not always that there will be a patent filed as a result of the project and that is the good outcome. The good outcome is ultimately that there's GDP as a result of the project. So that could be in licensing technologies. It could be that the trade secret output from one project because it becomes the input into another company, and that becomes an output into somebody else. And so there's that value chain approach. And so the first one is really thinking about the multiple different ways in which IP can be used to benefit the ecosystem. The second principle that we work with is around trust. So we require that companies come in and they collaborate, and that does not happen if companies cannot trust that they're doing that in a safe space for the IP that they're bringing. So it's maintaining the integrity of the background IP that companies are coming in with, and it's also ensuring that everybody's going to come out of this investment with the right to execute their business and have what they need to keep doing that. The third principle is around IP strategies supporting business strategies. So I've already touched on this. You know, your business strategy is what needs to drive decisions. It is not the way that you're going to protect your IP driving your business decisions. And so always having that business strategy top of mind and making IP decisions in accordance with that. And then the fourth principle, and we touched on this a bit as well, is that Canada's customer is global, right? So we need to think about what we need to do for the sake of meeting the requirements of the program. But at the end of the day, the value from these projects is going to come out in serving the global market. And so making sure that IP decisions are made in that context as well. And so those are the principles under which we sort of frame IP decisions. And then there's all the operational stuff that we need to do. And so as superclusters, we're all required to have our companies come in and build what we call an IP rationale for their project. So that is, it's really the IP strategy that they're all acting under. So we look at background intellectual property, we define what we expect the foreground intellectual property will be and help companies work through who's going to own it, how it'll be protected, who needs access to it, and ultimately what is the commercialization strategy around this IP. And then building kind of on that commercialization piece, because it is public funds going into the project, there always needs to be an understanding what the bigger benefit of the technology is, right? So it's great that the companies involved in the project are going to benefit, but how do Canadians benefit more broadly? So often that will be, you know, there's going to be a new type of product being made out of the lentils that we're growing in Canada, for instance, right? So that becomes a new product that Canadians can use, that growers will be able to sell their product into, and that's sort of an ecosystem sort of stream of thought around the IP. And then, so that's the rationale. The other piece of the sort of IP requirements is what was framed as an IP registry. At PIC, we built it as we call it the IP Hub, and it's an online portal where descriptions of the technologies that have been developed in the supercluster are housed, and it's member accessible. And it's really intended to be a mechanism for collaboration for companies to learn about what each other are doing and to reach out directly to each other and form new collaborations. So it's all non-confidential information, but enough to sort of, whet the appetite for companies to go in and work together. And so those are, those operational things are what we were required to do, but it really was the development of those principles that let us think strategically around what was important for the agri-food sector and the companies that we were working with to frame that out. So that's what we're doing today for PIC 1.0. And as we evolve into the next round of the superclusters, I think some of that will stick and will probably evolve even further.
So I'm going to take a slightly different look at this from a higher education perspective. More and more demand is being placed on graduating students that have that entrepreneur kind of free thinking attitude, and it's kind of ironic we're talking about this today on the UN designated day for creativity and innovation. That one of the things that has been lacking is just creative, innovative thinking. We kind of beat the heck out of curiosity out of kids coming out of high school for the sake of getting grades to get accepted into anything. And then we expect them in higher education to all of a sudden have a capstone project and this wonderful idea. And then what do you do with that idea? And so the intellectual property discussion needs to start at an early stage. But the approach that we're taking a look at is the market approach. In other words, what is the value of that thing, that property? And in terms of both the sustainability of the value and the cost to protect that. Is this an in and out, get into the market, it's going to get duplicated very rapidly? Or is this something that's got some legs to it that's worth looking at longer term protection? Because everybody, the first thing you get is, oh, I want to patent the thing. Well, that may not be the right market strategy to start with. Because by the time you might go through the patent process, especially depending on the region you're operating in, you may have blown your brains out and missed the market opportunity that existed. And so you have to put that into context. So we run boot camps for all of our startups. We run 3 of these a year, and they're very harsh in the sense that they're reality checks for what you're wanting to start your organization up with, or what idea you want to take to market, and what are the best strategies for protecting that IP, if you protect it at all, or whatever it may be. The interesting thing that I've seen a contrast between the two countries is, we've run the sort of Shark Tank kind of things. We ran them at SAIT, we run them at HCT. In Canada, the first thing the venture capital people, well, what's the state of your IP protection? Here, it's how big is your market and when can we put money into it? Oh, by the way, do you have intellectual property protection? Very different mindset on how they invest. They may talk a big story about IP protection here, but they want to get to market, get their money and get it out. So there's a different risk profile. And as I say, it's very regional. Now, as far as the strategies go, the basic knowledge around IP, I think, needs to be instilled upon everybody, every student. Any startup that comes along needs to get that basic fundamental thing. But then there is the economic development strategy around this. And so, Megan rightly pointed out how the superclusters had to develop this kind of collaborative IT kind of thing, which it's not a bad thing. And there's a living, breathing example. I think it still exists, Jeff, downtown Calgary, something called COSIA. And the whole oil sands, this is long term, big company collaborative. Believe it or not, you get these big flipping companies that actually would sit around the table and discuss highly, highly confidential, competitive, innovative stuff. And they come up with shared IP out of that. That's a fascinating model. And in the ag sector, because it has become this large industrial complex, you know, to get a buyer in one point and Agrium or whoever else, and you know, they all talk about. I don't know enough about how those companies behave, but I saw it, how it worked in the oil sands, and it just blew me away that you could get those together. And I think more and more that's going to have to happen. I think you're going to have this collaborative IP kind of sharing, and you're going to need to have good, sharp people that know how to cut those agreements that everybody mutually benefits from it. I think there's something to be said about scalability when it comes to that intellectual property, and it is something to think about. That's the best way to describe the two approaches in looking at it.
I think Alex made a really good point there. I think here there's been such a push for patenting because it helps increase the rankings, the global innovation rankings. So without really thinking about how you're going to use the technology, there's like, let's just file and patent everything. So one of the things we're doing, and I think a lot of the research here is taking place through the research organizations that are using public funds or the universities, is that we tell them, don't necessarily focus on patenting. You need to have an IP strategy, like Megan said, that's aligned with your overall business or organizational goals. But then also you need to think about implementing IP practices within the organization to make sure that, because we're such a transient place, there's people coming and going all the time, that knowledge is sort of leading with people. So make sure that IP that's developed stays with the institution or the startup or any organization that's creating that IP. Another point we've noticed is that they don't really have internal processes for identifying and managing the IP. So, one of the things we're working on with some of the clients here is creating sort of a technology transfer function for them. So they're doing a lot of research, but they don't necessarily know what to do when they think they've discovered something. So then we'll come along and say, okay, first of all, you need sort of an institutional IP policy that will make sure that you're not, owning in one area, in one agreement, or jointly owning in another, and then ending up with like a mishmash of a portfolio where the IP rights are not really clearly defined. You want to be able to have sort of a default policy and then look at each case by case. And then it also depends on the areas that you're funding in as well. So there might be areas which are more strategic that you want to maybe insist more on having an ownership position in, but there might be areas where you're happy to have sort of access rights or other types of rights to the IP. The other thing as well we've been advising them on is, instead of just funding research in these broadly defined areas, why don't you invest in doing sort of an IP landscaping analysis beforehand, so that you don't just spend the money in these areas and then later find out that actually some of this research has already been published, has already been done before. So that will help you sort of focus on more attractive areas for developing high value commercial IP. So these are some of the things that we're working on with institutions here. That I know that there is a preference here, if IP is generated, to try to commercialize that here. So to try to license that to a local entity. But the issue that we have here is that that market is not mature, it's not developed yet. So at this stage, we're still having to look at licensing partners abroad. But there is sort of a goal for them to create that ecosystem here. That will take time. And again, that ecosystem won't develop until we have a stronger IP protection and enforcement system as well. So we kind of have challenges on both ends here, but ultimately we do say that things are improving. I mean, I've seen so much improvement in the last 2 years, but this is more in terms of the legal and administrative side, and hopefully those changes will come into effect over the next year. But I think how these play out over the long term, I think it's a bit unclear at the moment. They're doing a lot to try to attract startups, but I think until we get to a point where startups feel like they can bring their IP here and they can enforce it here, I think we'll always have a little bit of a struggle, even if we have a lot of funding. So, yeah.
Jeff?
So I'm actually glad I'm going last in this one. I think those responses by Alex, Megan, and Tamara have been very comprehensive. But to me, I got, there are three takeaways to me. From Megan, business driven. Your IP strategy has to be business driven. From Alex, creativity, and from Tamara, internal organization. These are three pillars I deal with on a daily basis in dealing with clients in developing their IP strategy. We have to make sure that it's business driven. There's no point drafting patent applications or trademarks, anything, if it's not going to protect your business interests. So that's one of the top pillars of how our group works with our clients to make sure that you're not wasting your money or your time early on in the stages. And what we often come across in doing this is the lack of internal IP organization. And it's just, sometimes there's a lot going on for businesses at early stages. There's a lot of other things you need to deal with. Sometimes you don't even realize the fantastic IP that you're sitting on because it could be in a different department within your company, and one person's not talking to the other person in the right way, and maybe the CEO doesn't even know that their R&D group has made such a fantastic discovery. So bringing all of this together and realizing what the creativity, how those creative minds within the organization have worked and have developed IP that really is important and valuable to the business that should be protected. That's my goal as a patent age, as an IP lawyer, to work with my clients to achieve that end. And here at Gallings, I think those three pillars are very important to us. And we've developed, we have kind of a version to go with the good old 2.0 and 1.0, 2.0 versions. If you hop online, you'll see that we have a GoXL platform, and right now I would call it our version 1.0 that has launched, which is more just thought leadership pieces that professionals within our organization have posted. However, very soon you'll see launched the 2.0 version of this, which is going to have a robust library of interactive digital content, training sessions, how companies can manage their IP, how they can best interact with us to get proper protections in place. And for clients who want it, this will also have I'll call it a data room where you can dump your information and in a secure fashion, and we can work with you individually. It should create a better working relationship with our clients, and we're really looking forward to the launch. I think it's imminent from what I hear. So I was actually emailing one of the program managers on this to make sure I'm allowed to talk about it in this session, and I did get. So hopefully I'm not saying too much, and hopefully I'm not getting myself into trouble. But please keep an eye out on that. Google GoXL, and you'll see the platform, and within the coming week or so, you'll see it change drastically what the offering is going to be, and it's going to be. We think it'll be a great help to our clients.
Thank you, Jeff. I'm going to ask you another question, and then I see we have a raised hand, but we're getting close to the end as well. So I'm going to ask that you try to keep your responses short, remembering that I'm dealing with a couple of lawyers, at least on the call. So we'll see on that. When we were approached, and Jeff, you're the person who suggested the idea for this webinar, and including this presence from the UAE, I scratch my head a little bit and to understand where would the similarities be, and it's actually fantastic what we've done, because there are huge differences, but there are similarities as well in what were the challenges that we're facing, and I think it was really good to have this. And now I'm going to focus on the question. I'm going to ask the four of you in a brief way to say, what are the things that the governments have done or haven't done well to support IP protection? And I'm going to ask you that you refer to it, based on your experience and the governments that you're dealing with. So again, a little bit more political in terms of an answer, if I may, or on that. But I'm going to start by you, Jeff, because my little spidey sense tells me you've got a couple of things to say on that.
Yeah, I mean, obviously governments are pulled in a lot of different directions and have a lot of different priorities. Unfortunately, I think historically the ag tech sector has not gotten its fair attention from government, from a funding perspective, and from an innovation and protecting, innovation perspective as well. I think the tides are turning. I'll keep this answer short. I think the tides are turning. I mean, we have things like the superclusters that Megan's a part of. We have, budget 2021. We have budget 2022. Both of them, making promises and commitments towards putting more money towards the ag tech sector. One of these being the agricultural clean technology program. That was launched, I want to say 2018. With 25 million initially, I think, and then it went up to about 165 million. In budget 2022, the government has committed to triple that, to bring it up to 330 million or so. So, I think we're seeing commitments being made, and hopefully they come to fruition.
Tamara?
So I think with the UAE, it's a case of necessity drives innovation, in the sense that food security wasn't high on the agenda, but I think the fact that, we import most of our food, I think it's something up to 90%. And I think the recent events in the last couple of years have sort of pushed it higher on the agenda. So we're seeing a lot of investment in this space. As I mentioned, it was, I think recently, last year, they invested, or they committed about 300 million in terms of incentives to support ag tech businesses. They've also launched 10 ag tech incubators across the country. They've developed a national strategy, and they've created a dedicated body to help implement that strategy. I think they're very good, like Alex said, with coming up with these strategies, but there's a little bit of a disconnect in terms of how IP is important for that. And I think that's what's missing here. And that's the point we've been trying to drive home, is that, you can't create or support innovation without having a strong IP system. And I think that's where the government is falling short a little bit. But like I said, there has been a lot of focus recently on fixing this, because I think they're hearing it from all angles. So yeah, so I guess in terms of lacking, it's definitely IP infrastructure. And I think until that's resolved, we won't really see more sort of tech-based businesses in the region. Yeah.
Great. Megan, just before I go, I see that someone that Dan Polonenko, which I think was referred to by Alex, has put on the Q&As a link to what Jeff was talking about. So thank you, Dan, for doing that. Megan.
So I'll keep my answer pretty short. I think we've got a really interesting point in time in Canada right now, where there's a lot of federal investment going into IP education for SMEs. So we've got the superclusters looking at this. We have the Innovation Asset Collective active in the clean tech space. There's Business Development Canada, BDC has an IP-driven investment fund. Sustainable Development Technology Canada has not focused on IP. There are a lot of us working in the IP space, working to educate SMEs. I think the opportunity is being really coordinated in how we're doing that so that those investments are, the benefit of that investment is maximized and we're not all kind of doing the same thing in a disparate sort of way.
Alex, it's going to be your turn, but I do want to focus on that. The lack of coordination at the federal level is definitely of concern to AIC, hence the call for a national strategy on agri-food research and innovation. Alex.
So at the risk of getting on a soapbox, which I'll try not to, you know, I think Canadians do a fantastic job of bashing government. Having said that, there's been no shortage of funding, especially through the regional economic development agencies, the Tri-Council research organizations, a whole bunch of things that have funded all sectors. And I think the ag sector has been as beneficial as every other sector, quite frankly. But what's always been embedded in there, believe it or not, is conditional funding upon a statement of what the recipient has in place for IP protection. You can't get regional economic development funding. You can't get a Tri-Council grant unless, because it's clearly stated in all the applications. I've filled them out on behalf of institutions and behalf of companies. So you have to come up with something to at least show an awareness of intellectual property. And, you know, it could be argued in Canada that perhaps the government hasn't done enough to protect foreign takeover of our intellectual property. That I totally agree with. I mean, it befuddles me. We just seem to create all these wonderful things and then we just give it up to other countries. The UAE, Tamara rightly pointed out, is on this kick, but people have to remember it's only a 50-year-old country. And I get reminded of this all the time. Alex, we are still a developing country. And believe it or not, they're eligible for developing country funding. Just like China. China is considered a developing country. And there's certain maturity that doesn't exist here. That's part of the problem. And I think that's the muscle that's having to be developed here. So yeah, this part of the world, this country loves the bright, shiny object and patent. Oh, what does a patent mean? It just sounds like a cool thing. So patent. And it's the legal side to it, the ramifications has to catch up to it. And so there you have the contrast. I think you have a very mature economic development approach that's been honed over many years in Canada and is just getting going in this country here. I would argue though, UAE is going to be far more protective than Canada of its resources in a absolute big way, and they're not shy about going and acquiring stuff. If you ever hear the word mubadala in Canada, they're on the prowl for Canadian stuff. And they basically do most of the investment of the sovereign fund. They went out and bought an island off of Armenia, just so they could grow fresh fruits and vegetables for the UAE. That's what they do. So they'll get their economic strategy one way or the other. And okay, if it's the flavor of the month, patent, protect IP, okay, then we'll do it. Whether that's sustainable or continue that strategy, I don't know. That's a very interesting part of this part of the world.
Thank you very much, Alex, and thank you to all of you, Megan, Jeff, Tamara, and again, Alex. It was a great and really interesting webinar. I learned quite a bit on this, so I thank all of you for this. The webinar will be posted on our YouTube channel in the next day or so. Thanks for Christine for being the person behind the scene, making sure that this worked out well. And we will see, hopefully, most of you, Alex and Tamara. I don't expect that you're flying in for our May session in Ottawa, but we will see a number of you in Ottawa at our spring engagement session and a few other meeting, and we will be announcing the next webinars as soon as our May session is done. Again, thank you everyone for participating, and have a wonderful rest of the day, the night in the UAE. Thank you, guys. Thank you, ladies. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
Shukran.
you.
Have a good evening.
Bye-bye, everyone.